In 2024, the bustling streets of Lancaster, PA, were lined with a mix of quaint historical buildings and modern shops. The city had managed to preserve its charm while adapting to the times. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that would bring the nation to its knees, shattering the illusion of stability and progress. The financial markets had been showing signs of strain for months, but few paid attention. The economy was riding high on the back of technological advancements and consumer spending. People were confident that any hiccup would be temporary, just as they had been before the housing market crash of 2008. But this time, the crash would be far more devastating, echoing the events of the Great Depression that had been narrowly avoided in 1929. It started with whispers of trouble in the tech sector. Major corporations, once thought invincible, began to falter. Stock prices plummeted as investors lost faith, pulling their money out in a panic. The domino effect was swift and unforgiving. Banks, overextended and undercapitalized, began to fail. The contagion spread rapidly, wiping out savings and investments overnight. In Lancaster, the effects were immediate and brutal. Local businesses, which had thrived on a steady flow of tourists and a robust local economy, found themselves facing an existential crisis. The downtown area, once vibrant with activity, became a ghost town. Storefronts were boarded up, and for lease signs littered the streets. Families who had lived comfortably found themselves unable to make ends meet. The safety nets they had relied on were insufficient for the scale of the disaster. Food banks were overwhelmed, unable to keep up with the growing lines of desperate people. Shelters filled to capacity, turning away families who had nowhere else to go. Ignorance and denial played a significant role in exacerbating the crisis. Despite mounting evidence of the severity of the situation, many clung to the belief that the government or the market would somehow fix everything. Social media was awash with conspiracy theories and false hope, drowning out the voices of those who understood the gravity of the collapse. In the midst of this chaos, personal stories of hardship and resilience emerged. Sarah, a single mother of two, had worked as a nurse at the Lancaster General Hospital. She was laid off as the hospital struggled to cope with budget cuts. With her savings dwindling, she sold her car and moved her family into a small apartment in a less desirable part of town. The once cheerful and bustling home was now filled with the silent dread of uncertainty. James, a retired factory worker, saw his pension evaporate in the market crash. He had spent his life saving for a secure future, only to see it all disappear. With his pride wounded, he took to the streets, searching for odd jobs to keep himself afloat. The vibrant community he once knew was now a landscape of despair and hopelessness. Despite the overwhelming challenges, a sense of solidarity began to take root among the citizens of Lancaster. People organized makeshift soup kitchens and community gardens. They bartered goods and services, relying on each other in ways they never had before. But this resilience was not enough to counteract the systemic failures that had led to the catastrophe. The government's response was slow and inadequate. Political leaders were paralyzed by infighting and denial, unable to agree on a course of action. Bailouts and stimulus packages were debated endlessly, but no real relief materialized. The once mighty nation, blinded by its own hubris, found itself unable to comprehend the full scope of the disaster. As the months dragged on, the situation only worsened. Winter arrived, bringing with it a new set of challenges. Heating bills became an impossible burden for many, and stories of people freezing in their homes became disturbingly common. The streets of Lancaster, blanketed in snow, were eerily silent. The festive lights that once adorned the city were absent, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of a society in decline. Education, too, suffered. Schools, already underfunded, struggled to stay open. Teachers worked without pay, driven by a sense of duty to their students. But with resources dwindling, they could only do so much. Children, the unwitting victims of this crisis, were forced to grow up quickly, their innocence eroded by the harshness of their new reality. In the absence of effective leadership, communities began to fracture. Trust eroded as people became more desperate. Crime rates soared, and once safe neighborhoods became dangerous. Vigilante justice replaced the rule of law in some areas, as people took matters into their own hands. The social fabric of Lancaster, like the rest of the country, was unraveling. Churches, long a cornerstone of community support, struggled to provide solace. Their resources were stretched thin, and the questions they faced had no easy answers. Faith, for many, became a fragile thread in a world that seemed to have lost all meaning. As spring approached, there was no sign of relief. The economic collapse had become a protracted crisis with no end in sight. The lessons of history, ignored and forgotten, had come back to haunt the present. Lancaster, like so many other places, was a testament to the consequences of ignorance and denial. The city stood as a somber reminder that progress is fragile, and without vigilance, the past can repeat itself in the most devastating ways. And so, Lancaster endured, a city caught in the grip of a relentless depression. The hope for a resolution faded with each passing day, leaving its residents to navigate a world transformed by hardship and uncertainty. The shadows of the Great Depression, once a distant memory, had become a living nightmare in the year 2024. The longer the depression lingered, the more it eroded the very foundation of Lancaster. The people's resolve, while remarkable, was finite. Every day presented new challenges, and the weight of survival grew heavier. Neighbors who once offered each other support began to distance themselves, driven by an instinct for self-preservation. Local government officials tried their best to manage the chaos, but their efforts were often too little, too late. The city's infrastructure, already strained, began to crumble. Roads went unrepaired, public services deteriorated, and the once well-maintained parks became overgrown with neglect. The proud history of Lancaster, preserved in its architecture and culture, was slowly being swallowed by the relentless advance of decay. In the heart of the city, the Central Market, a historic staple of Lancaster life, struggled to stay open. Vendors who had sold their goods there for generations saw their livelihoods vanish. The market, usually filled with the aromas of fresh produce and baked goods, now smelled of desperation and rot. Stalls stood empty, a stark reminder of the economic devastation. Amid the worsening conditions, mental health became a critical concern. The constant stress and uncertainty took a toll on everyone. The local clinic, which once provided counseling services, was overwhelmed. There weren't enough professionals to address the growing crisis. Stories of suicides and mental breakdowns became tragically common, casting a dark shadow over the community. Thomas, a teenager who had just graduated high school, watched as his dreams of attending college dissolved. His father, a carpenter, lost his job when the construction industry collapsed. The family's savings, meant for Thomas's education, were now being used to keep a roof over their heads. Thomas took up a job at a dilapidated gas station, working long hours for meager pay. The future he had envisioned was replaced by a daily struggle for survival. Emily, a local artist, found her world turned upside down. Galleries closed, commissions dried up, and the art scene in Lancaster, once vibrant, became a casualty of the Depression. Emily turned to painting scenes of the city's plight, capturing the faces of those affected by the crisis. Her work, while poignant, was a stark reflection of the pervasive despair. Yet, it also served as a silent protest, a reminder of the humanity within the suffering. In the outskirts of Lancaster, the farming community faced its own set of challenges. Farmers, unable to sell their produce, watched their crops wither in the fields. The supply chain disruptions meant that even basic necessities became scarce. Bartering became the norm, with farmers trading food for goods and services. This return to an almost pre-industrial economy highlighted the depths to which society had fallen. The elderly, who had seen the world change so drastically over their lifetimes, were hit particularly hard. Many had no family left to care for them, and the social services they depended on had collapsed. Nursing homes became overcrowded and underfunded, leading to tragic neglect. Mary, an 82-year-old widow, found herself in one such facility. The isolation and lack of care eroded her health, but she maintained a fragile hope, often reminiscing about better times and sharing stories with anyone who would listen. With the onset of summer, temperatures soared, adding another layer of hardship. Power outages became frequent as the aging electrical grid failed under the strain. Air conditioning, once taken for granted, became a luxury few could afford. The sweltering heat drove people to seek relief wherever they could, from public fountains to shaded parks. However, These places, too, were overcrowded and could offer only limited respite. Water scarcity became a critical issue. The city's water infrastructure, neglected and underfunded, began to fail. Boil water advisories became a regular occurrence, and access to clean drinking water was no longer guaranteed. This public health crisis exacerbated the already dire conditions, leading to outbreaks of diseases like cholera and dysentery. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, struggled to cope with the influx of patients. In the midst of all this, a new kind of economy began to emerge. Black markets flourished, dealing in everything from basic necessities to illicit goods. The criminal element, always lurking in the shadows, seized the opportunity to expand their influence. Organized crime rings took control of essential resources, selling them at exorbitant prices. Law enforcement, underfunded and demoralized, was powerless to stop them. Community leaders, desperate to find a solution, called for town meetings. These gatherings, filled with heated debates and emotional pleas, often ended in frustration. Solutions were hard to come by, and unity was difficult to maintain in the face of such widespread suffering. The once strong social bonds that held Lancaster together were fraying. As autumn approached, there was no sense of relief. The harvest, once a time of celebration, was now a grim reminder of the hardships faced by the farming community. Crops rotted in the fields due to a lack of manpower and resources to harvest them. Food shortages became more acute, and hunger spread. People scavenged for whatever they could find, with many turning to foraging in the surrounding woods. Schools, barely functional, saw attendance plummet. Children were pulled out to help their families survive. Education, a cornerstone of progress, was sacrificed on the altar of necessity. Teachers, trying to keep some semblance of normalcy, faced an uphill battle. The future of an entire generation was jeopardized. The arts, culture, and traditions that had defined Lancaster were in danger of being lost. Festivals were cancelled, museums closed, and theaters went dark. The cultural lifeblood of the city was drained, leaving behind a hollow shell. People clung to memories of better times, but those memories offered little comfort in the face of daily hardship. As the year drew to a close, Lancaster stood as a testament to the fragility of society. The Great Depression of 2024 had not only crippled the economy but had also exposed the deep flaws and vulnerabilities within the modern world. The ignorance and denial that had allowed the crisis to spiral out of control were a stark reminder of the lessons unlearned from history. The city's residents, resilient as they were, could only do so much. The systemic failures required systemic solutions, but those solutions remained elusive. Lancaster, like the rest of the nation, was left to navigate an uncertain future, a future where the past's shadows loomed large and the promise of resolution seemed a distant dream. The bleakness of Lancaster persisted as winter began to set in once more. The air grew colder, and with it, the resolve of the people seemed to wane. What little hope had remained was now buried under the weight of relentless hardship. The crisis was no longer just economic, it had become a crisis of the soul. The daily struggle for survival took a toll on the community's spirit. Neighbors who once came together in solidarity now eyed each other with suspicion. Resources were scarce, and trust even scarcer. Stories of theft and betrayal spread, turning the once tight-knit community into a fractured mosaic of desperation. Healthcare continued to deteriorate. Hospitals, already stretched beyond their limits, faced even greater challenges as new waves of illness swept through the city. The elderly and vulnerable were the hardest hit, with many succumbing to preventable diseases. The death toll rose, and with it, a sense of pervasive grief that hung over Lancaster like a shroud. Martha, a seasoned nurse, had seen more than her share of suffering. Each day she walked into Lancaster General Hospital, she prepared herself for the worst. The hallways were filled with the cries of the sick and the dying. Supplies were running dangerously low, and the staff, though dedicated, were exhausted and demoralized. Martha moved through the chaos with a stoic determination, but even she felt the cracks forming in her resolve. Families were torn apart by the stress. Divorce rates soared as couples, unable to cope with the relentless pressure, sought escape from their strained relationships. Children, the silent witnesses to this unraveling, bore the brunt of the emotional fallout. The psychological scars left by the depression would haunt them for years to come. The city's infrastructure continued to crumble. Public transportation, once a reliable way to navigate Lancaster, became erratic. Buses broke down frequently, and the cost of maintenance became prohibitive. The streets, once bustling with activity, were now filled with potholes and littered with debris. The city, in many ways, was becoming a physical manifestation of the despair felt by its residents. Homelessness reached unprecedented levels. Tent cities sprang up in parks and under overpasses. These makeshift communities were plagued by violence and disease, offering only a semblance of shelter. John, a former factory worker, found himself living in one such encampment. He had lost his job, his home, and his family. The harsh conditions of the camp were a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Yet, even here, he found a kind of grim camaraderie among the displaced souls struggling to survive. The educational system was on the brink of collapse. Teachers, once pillars of the community, found themselves unable to continue. The school buildings, neglected and underfunded, fell into disrepair. Children, the hope for the future, were left to wander the streets. The loss of education was perhaps one of the most insidious effects of the Depression, robbing the next generation of the tools they would need to rebuild. Social unrest simmered beneath the surface. Protests and riots became more frequent as people grew increasingly desperate. The government's inability to provide solutions fueled a growing sense of anger and betrayal. Law enforcement, underfunded and overstretched, responded with increasing brutality. The streets of Lancaster became a battleground, with clashes between police and protesters becoming a common sight. Religious institutions, which had once offered a sense of hope and community, struggled to maintain their influence. Congregations dwindled as people lost faith in the institutions that had failed to protect them. The spiritual leaders, faced with their own crises of faith, could offer little more than hollow platitudes. The church bells, once a comforting sound, now rang with an almost mournful tone. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Lancaster settled into a grim routine. The idea of recovery seemed more distant than ever. The city's heartbeat, once strong and steady, now faltered. The residents, resilient as they were, began to accept that their lives had irrevocably changed. Amidst this backdrop of despair, small acts of kindness became lifelines. A loaf of bread left on a doorstep, a warm blanket shared with a stranger, a few kind words in the face of overwhelming sorrow. These gestures, though seemingly insignificant, were beacons of humanity in a world gone dark. They reminded the people of Lancaster that, despite everything, they were not entirely alone. The national and international response to the crisis was disheartening. Governments around the world faced their own versions of the Depression, struggling to manage collapsing economies and widespread social unrest. International aid, once a beacon of hope, became a distant memory. Each country turned inward, focusing on their own survival at the expense of global solidarity. In the halls of power, debates raged on without resolution. Politicians, trapped in their ideological silos, failed to grasp the urgency of the situation. Policy proposals were mired in bureaucracy, and any attempt at meaningful action was thwarted by partisan bickering. The people, watching from the sidelines, grew increasingly disillusioned with their leaders. As winter deepened, the reality of the situation set in. The Depression was not a temporary setback, it was a new way of life. The systemic failures that had led to this point were too deeply entrenched to be easily undone. The people of Lancaster, and indeed the nation, faced a long and arduous journey ahead. The personal stories of hardship multiplied, each one a testament to the human cost of the Depression. Rachel, a young woman who had been studying to become a doctor, found herself working in a dilapidated clinic. Her dreams of medical school were deferred indefinitely. She treated patients with whatever supplies she could scavenge, driven by a sense of duty and a faint hope that one day, things might get better. Marcus, a former businessman, wandered the streets in search of work. His polished suits were now threadbare, his once confident demeanor replaced by a haunted look. He had lost everything in the crash: his job, his home, his family. Each day was a battle to maintain a semblance of dignity in a world that seemed intent on stripping it away. Community efforts to rebuild and support each other, though valiant, were insufficient. Mutual aid groups and grassroots organizations sprang up, offering whatever assistance they could. They provided food, clothing, and a sense of solidarity, but the scale of the crisis overwhelmed their efforts. The systemic issues required systemic solutions, but those solutions remained elusive. The arts, long a source of solace and inspiration, struggled to survive. Musicians, artists, and writers found themselves without patrons or audiences. Yet, in the face of adversity, creativity found new forms. Street performances, murals depicting the struggles of the people, and makeshift theaters became outlets for expression. These acts of creativity were defiant gestures against the pervasive despair, small flames of hope in the darkness. As the year drew to a close, Lancaster was a city transformed. The Great Depression of 2024 had reshaped every aspect of life, leaving a scar that would not easily heal. The people, resilient but weary, faced an uncertain future. The lessons of history, ignored and forgotten, had returned with a vengeance. The shadow of ignorance had cast a long and dark pall over the city, a stark reminder of the fragility of progress. Lancaster endured, its spirit battered but not entirely broken. The story of the Depression was a story of survival, of the human capacity to endure even the harshest of circumstances. It was a story without a clear resolution, a reflection of the complex and often brutal reality of life. The people of Lancaster, and the world, were left to navigate this new reality, forever changed by the lessons they had learned the hard way. In the depths of winter, as snow covered the streets and the cold seeped into every corner, Lancaster stood as a testament to the resilience and vulnerability of humanity. The future remained uncertain, but the people continued to endure, holding on to the fragile threads of hope and humanity in a world transformed by despair. Spring arrived in Lancaster with a muted sense of renewal. The usual anticipation of warmer days and new beginnings was overshadowed by the ongoing depression. The blooming flowers and budding trees seemed out of place against the backdrop of human suffering and economic collapse. The markets were still desolate, and the once thriving heart of the city remained eerily quiet. The few businesses that managed to stay open operated on a shoestring budget. Their owners, driven by sheer willpower, fought to provide services to a community in desperate need. The Central Market, now a shadow of its former self, became a place where people exchanged whatever they could spare: food, clothes, and stories of endurance. Anna, a high school teacher, turned her home into a makeshift classroom. With the schools in shambles, education had become a luxury few could afford. Anna gathered neighborhood children around her dining table, teaching them with whatever resources she could find. Her lessons were as much about survival and hope as they were about math and reading. She believed in the power of education to plant seeds of resilience in young minds, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The social fabric of Lancaster continued to fray. Crime was rampant, fueled by desperation and a lack of resources. The police, underfunded and overstretched, could do little to maintain order. Vigilante groups formed, taking the law into their own hands, often leading to more chaos and violence. Trust between the citizens and the authorities eroded, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Housing became an even more pressing issue as landlords, unable to collect rent, abandoned properties. Squatters moved into empty buildings, creating impromptu communities with their own rules and hierarchies. These new settlements were fraught with danger but offered a semblance of shelter to those who had nowhere else to go. Despite the dire circumstances, there were pockets of resilience and solidarity. Community gardens, though initially small and scattered, began to flourish as more people joined the effort. These gardens provided not just food but also a sense of purpose and community. They became places where people gathered to share skills, stories, and a brief respite from the harsh realities of their lives. David, a former chef, found solace in these gardens. After losing his restaurant and his home, he had drifted aimlessly, his passion for cooking extinguished. But in the community garden, he rediscovered his love for food. He taught others how to grow and cook with the limited resources they had, turning basic ingredients into nourishing meals. His small acts of culinary creativity became a symbol of hope for many. Religious leaders, struggling with their own crises of faith, continued to offer what support they could. Churches, synagogues, and mosques opened their doors to provide shelter, food, and a sense of community. Father Michael, a priest at St. Mary's Church, saw his congregation dwindle but refused to give up. He organized soup kitchens and offered counseling, using his faith to inspire others to hold on just a little longer. The arts, though severely impacted, found ways to persist. Street artists painted murals depicting the struggles and resilience of the people. These vibrant works of art became a visual testament to the enduring human spirit. Musicians performed in parks and on street corners, their music a poignant reminder of the beauty that still existed amidst the despair. The national situation remained grim. Political leaders, entangled in bureaucracy and partisanship, failed to provide meaningful solutions. Protests and civil unrest became more frequent as people demanded change. The government's slow and inadequate response only deepened the sense of disillusionment and betrayal. As summer approached, the heat brought new challenges. Water scarcity became critical, with many areas experiencing severe shortages. The city's water infrastructure, already in disrepair, buckled under the strain. People lined up for hours at public water stations, rationing every drop. This crisis exacerbated health issues, with dehydration and waterborne diseases becoming rampant. In the midst of this, the media played a crucial role. Journalists, often working under dangerous conditions, documented the human stories behind the statistics. They highlighted the everyday heroes and the systemic failures, keeping the plight of places like Lancaster in the national consciousness. Their reports were a stark reminder of the consequences of ignorance and denial. Internationally, the global economy continued to suffer. Countries faced their own versions of the Depression, struggling with similar issues of unemployment, social unrest, and resource scarcity. International aid, which might have alleviated some suffering, was almost non-existent as nations turned inward, focusing on their own crises. Despite the overwhelming challenges, there were glimmers of hope. Innovative solutions began to emerge from the grassroots level. Community organizers, scientists, and entrepreneurs came together to find ways to address the most pressing needs. These efforts were often localized and small in scale but represented a growing movement towards self-reliance and sustainability. By autumn, Lancaster had settled into a grim acceptance of its new reality. The city's infrastructure was still in disarray, but the people had adapted. They had learned to live with less, to find joy in small victories, and to support each other in ways they never had before. The Depression had reshaped the city, stripping away the superficial and revealing the core of human resilience. Stories of survival became the new folklore. Children, sitting around makeshift fires, listened to tales of their parents and grandparents overcoming impossible odds. These stories, passed down through generations, would become the foundation of a new cultural identity, one built on endurance, solidarity, and the unyielding human spirit. The Great Depression of 2024 had irrevocably changed Lancaster. It had exposed the deep flaws in society but also revealed the strength and compassion of its people. The city, once a symbol of stability and progress, had become a testament to the fragility of modern life. Yet, in the face of relentless hardship, the people of Lancaster had found a way to endure, to adapt, and to hold on to the fragile threads of hope and humanity. The year was 2034, and the world was still deep in the throes of the Great Depression that began a decade earlier. The economic collapse had reshaped the global landscape, and in Lancaster, PA, the sense of despair had only deepened. As the year unfolded, an even graver threat loomed on the horizon: a new war, born from the desperation of nations racing to secure dwindling resources of gold and silver. Lancaster had become a city accustomed to hardship. The streets were filled with crumbling buildings and makeshift homes, remnants of a once thriving community. The people had adapted to their new reality, finding ways to survive amidst scarcity and decay. Yet, the announcement of an impending war sent shockwaves through the city, stirring old fears and new uncertainties. The news broke one cold morning in January. Radios crackled to life with urgent broadcasts, and makeshift televisions in community centers displayed the grim faces of world leaders. Nations, crippled by economic desperation, were now in a frenzied scramble to secure the planet's remaining precious metals. Gold and silver, long symbols of wealth and stability, had become the lifeblood of governments seeking to prop up their failing economies. As diplomatic efforts failed, the world stood on the brink of conflict. In Lancaster, the impact was immediate. The already scarce resources became even more precious as governments diverted what they could to support the war effort. The black market, which had thrived in the shadows, became even more ruthless and dangerous. Organized crime syndicates, sensing opportunity, tightened their grip on the city, controlling the flow of essential goods and services. Anna, the high school teacher who had turned her home into a classroom, found herself at a loss. The children she taught were now growing up in a world where the threat of war overshadowed every aspect of life. She tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the pervasive fear and uncertainty made it difficult. Her lessons now included basic survival skills, as much about preparing for the future as they were about history or literature. David, the former chef who had found solace in community gardening, faced new challenges. The gardens, once a symbol of resilience, became targets for looters and thieves. Food, already scarce, was now more valuable than ever. David and his fellow gardeners took turns guarding their crops, but the constant vigilance wore on them. The sense of community they had built was under siege, just like the city itself. John, who had been living in a tent city, found himself once again displaced. The encampments were torn apart as the government requisitioned land for military purposes. John wandered the streets, searching for a new place to call home. The camaraderie he had found among the homeless was now fragmented, as people scattered in search of safety and stability. The local government, struggling to maintain order, implemented rationing and curfews. Martial law was declared, and the National Guard patrolled the streets. The sight of soldiers in full combat gear became a common one, a stark reminder of the escalating conflict. Civil liberties, already eroded by the Depression, were further curtailed in the name of security. The people of Lancaster, already worn down by years of hardship, faced the new restrictions with a mix of resignation and defiance. Father Michael, the priest at St. Mary's Church, tried to offer solace to his dwindling congregation. The church, which had been a refuge, now echoed with the prayers and pleas of those seeking comfort in uncertain times. Father Michael himself struggled with his faith, questioning how a benevolent deity could allow such suffering. Yet, he continued to provide what he could: a listening ear, a warm meal, a place to rest. His sermons, once filled with hope, now spoke of endurance and the strength to face whatever came next. The announcement of war brought a new urgency to the political landscape. The government's focus shifted from economic recovery to military preparedness. Factories that had been shuttered were reopened and repurposed for war production. The workforce, depleted and demoralized, was conscripted into service. Young men and women, who had grown up in the shadow of the Depression, now faced the prospect of fighting a war they barely understood. In the midst of this turmoil, a clandestine resistance movement began to take shape. A group of individuals, disillusioned with the government's handling of the crisis, came together to oppose the war and the exploitation of resources. They operated in the shadows, spreading their message through underground publications and secret meetings. Their goal was to unite the people of Lancaster, and beyond, against the forces driving the world toward conflict. Rachel, the young woman who had deferred her dreams of becoming a doctor, found herself drawn to the resistance. Working in the dilapidated clinic, she saw firsthand the toll the war preparations were taking on the community. Patients who might have survived under better circumstances were dying from neglect and lack of resources. The resistance offered her a way to fight back, to channel her frustration and grief into action. She became a key member, using her medical skills to tend to injured activists and her knowledge to help plan their actions. As spring turned to summer, the war officially began. The first reports of skirmishes and battles came from distant lands, but it wasn't long before the conflict reached closer to home. Lancaster, like many other cities, was drawn into the maelstrom. Military convoys rolled through the streets, and the distant sound of gunfire became an unsettling backdrop to daily life. The once stable and orderly society was now fully in chaos. Food and water shortages grew worse as supply lines were disrupted. Electricity became sporadic, plunging the city into darkness and cold. The infrastructure, already fragile, buckled under the strain of war. Schools closed, hospitals overflowed, and the streets became dangerous, lawless places. Amid the chaos, the resistance movement grew bolder. They sabotaged military operations, distributed food and supplies to those in need, and spread their message of defiance. Their actions brought hope to some but also drew the ire of the authorities. The National Guard cracked down hard, and members of the resistance were arrested or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Yet, the movement persisted, driven by the belief that they were fighting for the soul of their city and their world. The war and the depression combined to create a nightmarish reality. Families were torn apart as members were conscripted or fled in search of safety. Communities that had stood together for generations were fractured. The very fabric of society seemed to be unraveling, with no clear path to recovery or peace. As the year drew to a close, Lancaster was a city on the edge. The constant strain of war, economic hardship, and social unrest had taken its toll. Yet, amid the ruins, there were still sparks of resilience and humanity. People continued to find ways to support each other, to resist the forces that sought to destroy them, and to hold on to the hope that one day, the darkness would lift. The future remained uncertain, but the people of Lancaster had learned to endure. They had faced a decade of unrelenting hardship and now stood on the precipice of an even greater challenge. Their story was one of survival, of the unyielding human spirit, and of the fight for a better tomorrow in a world seemingly determined to descend into chaos. By early 2035, the landscape of Lancaster, PA, had grown even more complex and perilous. The government's efforts to enforce martial law and crack down on resistance met with unexpected obstacles. While the primary branches of the military remained largely loyal, fractures began to appear within smaller military units and private contractors. These groups, foreseeing their eventual betrayal by a desperate government once funding ran dry, decided to put their faith in the people rather than the regime. In Lancaster, The police forces, fire departments, and medical staff also began to show signs of defiance. The draconian measures demanded by the government threatened to bleed their departments dry, both in terms of resources and morale. Faced with the prospect of turning against the very people they had sworn to protect, these civil servants chose a different path. Captain Marie O'Donnell of the Lancaster Police Department was among the first to voice her dissent. At a clandestine meeting with her officers, she spoke of the oaths they had taken and the true meaning of service. "We joined to protect and serve our community," she said, her voice resolute. "Not to oppress it. If we follow these orders, we lose the very soul of our profession." Her words resonated deeply with her officers. Many had seen the effects of the Depression firsthand: neighbors, friends, and family members suffering under the weight of relentless poverty. They agreed to form a silent pact, subtly undermining the government's efforts by providing intelligence to the resistance and turning a blind eye to their activities whenever possible. Similarly, Chief Walter Granger of the Lancaster Fire Department faced a moral dilemma. The new regulations required them to prioritize resources for military installations over civilian needs. Fires in residential areas were to be left unattended if it meant conserving resources for the war effort. Granger, a man who had spent his life fighting fires and saving lives, couldn't reconcile this with his duty. He convened a secret assembly with his firefighters, and together they decided to ignore these orders, committing instead to protect their community at all costs. The medical staff at Lancaster General Hospital, led by Dr. Susan Patel, also chose to resist. The government's demands to redirect medical supplies to military hospitals would have left their civilian patients without essential care. Dr. Patel, alongside her dedicated team, decided to keep their focus on the civilian population, providing underground medical support to those in need, including members of the resistance. As these defiant acts spread, the morale of the people of Lancaster began to lift slightly. The knowledge that not everyone in a position of power was against them brought a glimmer of hope. The resistance, emboldened by the support from within these critical institutions, ramped up their efforts. The small military units and private contractors who had turned against the government began to coordinate with the resistance. These soldiers, disillusioned with the state of the nation, brought valuable skills and resources to the fight. They knew the inner workings of military operations and used this knowledge to sabotage government efforts from within. They trained civilians in guerrilla tactics, providing the resistance with a much-needed edge. One such group, led by Sergeant Ethan Caldwell, a seasoned veteran, became a pivotal force in the resistance. Caldwell's unit had seen the worst of the government's betrayal, left without pay and supplies as the war effort drained resources. They defected, bringing with them not only their expertise but also a cache of weapons and equipment. Caldwell's strategic mind and unwavering resolve made him a natural leader in the fight against oppression. These collaborations led to a series of successful operations. The resistance managed to disrupt supply lines, sabotage key infrastructure, and staged daring rescues of captured comrades. Each victory, no matter how small, fueled the fire of rebellion and further eroded the government's control. In the midst of this turmoil, the community gardens, once simple acts of survival, became clandestine hubs for resistance planning. David, the former chef, turned gardener, now found himself organizing more than just planting schedules. The gardens provided cover for meetings and the exchange of critical information. They were a symbol of defiance, thriving in the face of adversity. Rachel, the young medic, found her role expanding. She became a key figure in the underground medical network, coordinating care and supplies across the city. Her small clinic turned into a sanctuary for the wounded and the weary, a place where the spirit of resistance was kept alive through acts of healing and compassion. Father Michael, too, played a crucial role. His church became a safe haven, offering refuge to those fleeing government crackdowns. He smuggled messages and supplies under the guise of religious activities, using the church's network to support the resistance. His sermons, once somber, now carried a subtle message of defiance and hope, encouraging his congregation to stand firm in their beliefs. As the war dragged on and the economic depression deepened, the global situation grew increasingly dire. Other cities and towns began to mirror Lancaster's defiance. Across the United States and beyond, police, firefighters, and medical staff joined the ranks of those who refused to uphold oppressive orders. The resistance movements, though fragmented, began to communicate and coordinate, forming a loose but growing network of defiance. The government's response grew more desperate and brutal, but the widespread dissent made it difficult to enforce their will. The crackdowns, intended to crush resistance, instead fueled it, as more people saw the government's true nature and chose to fight back. In Lancaster, the resistance continued to grow stronger. The small victories accumulated, and the spirit of the people, though battered, remained unbroken. They knew the fight was far from over, but with every act of defiance, they inched closer to a future where they could reclaim their city and their lives from the grip of tyranny and despair. The year 2035 ended with Lancaster standing as a beacon of resistance. The struggle was far from over, and the path ahead remained fraught with danger and uncertainty. But the people of Lancaster, united by their shared hardship and unwavering resolve, had found their strength. In the face of overwhelming odds, they continued to fight, to endure, and to hope for a better tomorrow. By 2036, the entire northeastern United States was in uproar. The decade-long economic depression and the ensuing war had pushed the populace to its breaking point. The government's failure to address the crisis and its heavy-handed tactics had alienated the masses. The widespread dissent in Lancaster had sparked a broader movement, with cities and towns across the region rising up in defiance. As the presidential election approached, the American people were fed up with the status quo. Both the Republican and Democratic parties had failed to provide solutions, their policies seen as self-serving and disconnected from the harsh realities faced by ordinary citizens. The public's anger reached a boiling point, and a groundswell of support for an independent candidate began to build. The independent candidate, Mark Henderson, was a former governor with a reputation for integrity and pragmatic solutions. He had been a vocal critic of the government's handling of the Depression and the war, advocating for policies that prioritized the welfare of the people over corporate and military interests. Henderson's campaign, fueled by grassroots support, promised to bring about the change that both major parties had failed to deliver. Lancaster became a key battleground in the election. The resistance movement threw its full support behind Henderson, seeing in him a potential ally who could address their grievances and restore hope to their beleaguered community. Campaign rallies were held in the city's makeshift squares, drawing crowds that had not gathered for any political event in years. The spirit of resistance and defiance was now channeled into a political revolution.